The Great Lakes state is known for its 4 seasons: cold, snowy winters, rainy, blossoming springs, very hot summers, and cool, colorful falls. Michigan residents are used to the weather changing on a daily basis within those seasons. It might rain in the morning, be sunny midday, and then a snowstorm will arrive in the evening. This happens so regularly that it no longer comes as a surprise. But every so often, the climate oscillations are abnormal. Rare cases such as high heat in March followed by frost in April, then a drought in June and July, such as the weather Michigan has experienced this year, impacts everyone. Fruit and vegetable crops, livestock, and timber are all affected, and these outcomes eventually trickle down to you. But before we get into that, here's Sarah Adams to fully explain exactly what's been happening in Michigan recently.
The U.S. Department of Agriculture has declared the entire state of Michigan a natural disaster area. So it might be considered an understatement to say that so far, 2012 has been an unusual year.
January and February, we had very warm temperatures and very dry conditions. It was actually the 4th warmest winter on record in the U.S. and the 3rd least snowiest in the U.S. So that's very unusual. And then we continued to stay warm and really warmed up in the month of March. For the state of Michigan, the month of March, we were 13 degrees Fahrenheit above normal for the whole state, which is almost like science fiction. It's so unusual.
But then if we thought those unusual conditions were behind us here in Michigan, think again. Mother Nature was just getting warmed up, literally.
And we just didn't have the rain into April and May. And after the dry conditions, it became hot and dry. We got into June and now into July, the drought has really become exacerbated. Very warm temperatures and next to no rain, especially for the southern portion of the Lower Peninsula.
According to the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, July was the hottest month on record in the United States since record-keeping began in 1895. Dr. Baxter says the unusual weather in 2012 was caused by a perfect storm of weather factors.
So you might have heard of El Nino. That's the warming of the waters in the equatorial Pacific. Or you've heard the opposite of El Nino, which is La Nina, which is the cooling of the waters in the Pacific. So those would be two sides of a coin that kind of flips back and forth.
El Nino and La Nina take turns affecting the weather every 2 to 7 years. And then that can last for a year to a year and a half. And then other weather factors can also come into play within that whole cycle. Sound confusing? Well, Dr. Baxter says he often uses an orchestra metaphor to explain it better, comparing weather patterns to various instruments taking the lead when an orchestra is performing.
But sometimes the violinist gives a solo, and that means one of the climate oscillations is coming out and becoming dominant. Sometimes the whole string section comes out, and that's when you really see an influence on the weather. Climate oscillations acting in concert to really warm us up. So it can happen and it does happen. It just doesn't happen very often that everything is working together to create very anomalous weather for one part of the country. And the length of that and the extreme temperatures it's almost like, could this really happen? I think it's to the edge of what's possible within the climate system.
As you've probably guessed by now, the effects of this unusual weather have taken their toll on almost every aspect of Michigan produce, crops, and livestock.
Michigan is quite unique in the fact of the diverse commodities it has. We have nearly 300 different commodities when you count all the different types of floriculture, the fruits, the vegetables, corn, soybeans, hogs, cattle, sheep. There's nearly 300 different commodities, which is second only to California.
Pockets of drought in Michigan that have affected the field crops and pastures especially. But the combination of the freeze and the drought, and we're like a equal opportunity for all growing plants this year on being affected somehow.
The very warm March allowed the fruit trees to begin budding out early, and then we came into April and got some of Michigan's normal cold temperatures. We had 9 freeze events in a short period of time in April after trees began budding early, which really devastated the fruit crop in this state.
And then there are Michigan-grown crops, and it's not all bad news there. Wheat, for example, came out okay.
The wheat crop came out not only a very high yield, but also very high quality, so that was a shining point this year.
And soybeans might just pull through in the 11th hour.
I went through a dry period, but they mature a little bit later. They go through their key pollination period a little bit later, and we've had some recent rains, which we're hopeful will help the soybeans. And there was still some growth to be done, so we can be hopeful, hopefully.
And how are things looking for corn?
This drought, unfortunately, is covering the entire U.S. So when we estimated planted acreage back in March at 94 million acres of corn in the U.S., that was a record planting for a number of acres of corn. Because of the drought across the entire growing area, the price of corn is now in the $8.50 range. Instead of $4, it's $8.50. So if there's a silver lining here for Michigan producers, I don't, obviously you hate to lose your yield, but at least the price is much higher than was expected.
And then we come to livestock. You guessed it, 2012 wreaked havoc there as well.
We often hear from our field offices, it's looking a little dry, the pasture growth is slowing down, my pastures are getting crunchy. What should I be doing with my livestock? I said, feed them. Don't rely on the pasture to be the only food source now. It's getting shorter as we're using it, and it's not recovering because it's too hot and too dry. So if they didn't have their own hay store or purchased grains already, then they're subject to the supply and demand of the current day.
On a positive note, for Michigan, the milk industry in Michigan has been a shining star for several years. They continue to outperform all the eastern states, east of Mississippi, on milk produced per cow.
And then there are agricultural problems that no one saw coming.
I forgot to think about spider mites that like the dry. So we always think, oh, diseases, warm, moist, but we forget dry conditions also have pests too. So the crop scouting, I should do a better job of that next year. I should make notes now on what happened so I know when to look for it in the future.
No matter what type of agriculture in this year in Michigan, you were adversely affected one way or the other by different weather patterns. So it's been a challenging year across the state.
Now, Sarah, these abnormal conditions Michigan's been experiencing, they've given agriculture a break here and there, right?
Yeah, at least in Michigan, there have been a few breaks in the heat and a few rounds of storms and some cold fronts. Unfortunately, though, the central United States hasn't seen many breaks.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. When we notice abnormal weather and wonder how it will affect our pocketbooks, we often start thinking about how it will change the prices of our fresh foods. We consider our agriculture, and more specifically, our crops. Well, a visit to Leelanau County's local farmers warranted a first-hand perspective on what northern Michigan has been experiencing these last few months and the impact on their fruits. According to the USDA, production of cherries throughout the state is at less than a tenth of what it normally would be. The abnormal climate conditions have been especially difficult for northern Michigan farmers.
I've been farming all my life, and this is the second year we've had in the last 10 years where we've had a disaster. 2002, we had hardly any cherries. This year, even worse. It's affected peaches, plums, apricots, cherries. The drought has really hurt everybody. First we had the snowstorm, then the hot weather, then we had frost. So we don't have much of a cherry crop at all.
This year the cherries are at about 98-99% loss for our tart cherries. Sweet cherries we're at about 85-90% loss.
And the story is the same across the state. Normally producing around 120 million pounds of cherries in a year, this year Michigan farms are down to 5 million pounds, all thanks to the warm March followed by frost. The frost also affected soft fruits such as pears, plums, and peaches.
Pears, pretty much a total loss. Plums are a total loss. Peaches, everybody wants peaches and we only have a few.
The high winds and frost hurt apples. The USDA is predicting less than 3% of the average crop this year. As for grapes, Michigan has about a third of the normal crop, but that's speaking overall. Juice grapes were hit very hard, as they are affected similarly to other soft fruits, as they started maturing with the warm weather early and were then hit with the frost. Because wine grapes tend to be a little more dormant, some were spared. And then the real heat hit.
One thing to be aware of is that in most cases, wine grapes are very thrifty growers, very tenacious, very deeply rooted in the soils that we have. And so while the drought has been a serious problem for a lot of different crops around the state, it's relatively easy for wine grapes with their deep root system to get through a growing season like this without bad effects.
In fact, Leelanau County's El Mauby vineyards are even ahead of schedule for harvest by about 3 weeks. Also in Leelanau County, Vertero Winery is seeing the benefits.
Droughts in the vineyard in the summer, we actually are quite happy about. I think for us, it was not only the early warmth, but it's the fact that we've had such a warm summer. So our degree growing days, which is the true measurement scientifically that we watch, we're probably right now 25 to 30% ahead of last year, which was an exceptional year. And we're at least that above the 5-year average for this climate. So the grapes love this kind of heat. Here in northern Michigan, we may have had the 2 best back-to-back grape harvests in at least a decade, if not 2 decades.
But not every wine grape has thrived in the summer's heat. Young vines were hurt by the summer drought, as their roots aren't deeply rooted enough to draw up the necessary water to survive. Although the vineyards for Vertero Winery have some young vines that are struggling, they've learned how to adapt.
Over the last 10 years, we've really watched the weather patterns here much more closely as we've built the vineyards. And it's not atypical to have a drought in the spring, a drought in the summer, and a drought in the fall up here. So knowing that history, again, would say that my advice to most people who would be planting up here, plant and put in irrigation. Our first plantings, this goes back into 2005 now, where we planted 1.5 acres basically of young plants with no irrigation. And we had a lot of vine loss because in that first year we had a prolonged drought, not too dissimilar to what we've had and experienced this summer, where you go 6-7 weeks without any kind of appreciable rain, and we lost a lot of plants. So that convinced us at that time that as we continued to plant in our 2 main vineyard sites, that we would put in irrigation, particularly to nurture those young plants along until they become 4- or 5-year-old plants.
The rainfall varies so dramatically in northern Michigan that 12 miles down the road, Larry Mauby's non-irrigated new vines are doing just fine.
We actually planted vines this spring. They were replants in existing vineyards, and they are thriving well. We've had sufficient rainfall at the right time to keep them alive without needing to bring water to them. So that's why I say it's been a drought in many parts of the state, and we've been fortunate. We've had just enough rain at the right time for those young vines to get by.
But the vines down the Lake Michigan shoreline from the Leelanau Peninsula were one of those parts of the state that haven't been as fortunate.
Now, southwestern Michigan, grapes got hurt with frosts, and they've had a more serious drought situation than we have, with already stressed vines that were hurt by frost. So for them, a different situation than for us here. We've been very fortunate.
That's farming. I mean, it's never the same. Every year is different.
So as northern Michigan's vineyard owners have been loving this year's weather, the same can't be said about other parts of Michigan's agriculture industry, like the soft fruits. Mike Horace shares the impact on Michigan's vegetables and trees.
Farmers were initially quite happy about the record warm temperatures we saw in March. It meant they could get an early start on planting their crops.
Our crops were planted in a pretty timely manner this spring because it started to dry, and we always like to have the early planting, because that's the earlier we can plant, we can get the most optimum yields for the season. So we put the crop in early, and then it basically, the rain shut off and things changed from there. The first crop that was affected by the lack of rain was the hay crop in the central Michigan area. We had, with the frost, the early start, the frost, and then we didn't get the rains. The yields on the first cutting hay crop were greatly reduced. Then you would follow up by corn, was then impacted by the drought, the dry weather, and the hot conditions in late June and early July.
Corn is a very fickle plant. There's not a lot of time to get it off to a good start. That can cause some problems if the weather doesn't cooperate.
Corn grows and it pollinates, so there's really one chance for that to happen. And we had the extreme hot weather during that pollination period. And there's about a 10-day window for pollination on corn. And basically when you start seeing the tassels in the field and then the silks coming out, that's that window. And if we have drought, heat, it affects pollination. It only occurs once on the corn plant. And if we have poor pollination or no pollination, we have no grain.
While parts of the state saw their corn crops devastated by the drought earlier this year, other areas actually got rain and are doing quite well.
In the central Michigan area, we probably are as good as any place in the state. Some consider like Gratiot, Isabella County, in that belt through here is kind of the garden spot of Michigan. But you go south, their crop is pretty much a total loss. They just did not receive any of the rains. And some of their soils are lighter, coarse texture, sandy soils. So they need much, their water holding capacity isn't there. So they need very timely rains for the crop. It's kind of like one man's junk is another man's treasure. I mean, I think some of the cash crop farmers, the corn and soybean and wheat farmers, well, they're really, if you've had rain and you're really enjoying, your yield and your price, it really, really hurts our livestock people, because the livestock industry is much more challenged with the high grain prices. They have to purchase the grain, they have to purchase the soybean meal, which is made from soybeans, to feed the poultry, the hogs, and like the dairy and the beef industry buy a tremendous amount of protein. So that the expenses that they have it just doesn't work out on paper to buy this expensive grain to feed those livestock. So some sectors are hurting just because of the high corn and soybean prices, which is brought about by the drought.
It isn't just field crops that need timely rain to survive. So too do Christmas trees.
I can show you 6-foot tall trees that died. So, I mean, that was not good, because that basically means at 6 foot tall, they would have basically been at a saleable size, and they're not. They're dead now. I never had a problem like this. They didn't take it at all. In some areas, I guarantee it's up somewhere around 90% that you lost on trees. The pines took it real well. There's not a problem with the pines. The firs are the ones that didn't take it very well. Fraser firs, which are the most popular Christmas tree, got hammered. Yeah, unless we can sell them in orange trees, maybe they work out for Halloween or something, but otherwise they're in trouble. Typically, it's gonna hurt us, yes. I mean, now I gotta spend umpteen dollars to replace what we got here. And it's not a lot harder, because you gotta go and spot them in the field. You don't go out and rip the whole field up anymore when you got them dead here and there all over.
Horrocks says the last several years have been drier than usual, and if that trend continues, it will just cause more problems down the road.
We're going to be drilling a well out here and putting trickle system in. We don't have a choice if it comes down to that. So it's going to be costly, but it's going to be better for the trees. They'll grow faster and stuff like that. But again, it's a cost that typically you don't put into Christmas trees.
Mike, will there be a shortage of Christmas trees this year?
Well, not this year, because in general, the larger trees that are almost big enough to sell held up fairly well in the drought. It's the smaller trees, the ones growers would be selling in 4, 5, even 6 years, that were most affected. So at least in the Christmas tree industry, we're going to be feeling the effects of this drought for years to come.
Okay, and getting back to the field crops and the livestock issue for a moment, Paul Gross mentioned that for some producers, it's getting harder and harder to feed their livestock. If they can't afford to feed their cattle, their swine, what options do they have?
Well, sadly, the answer is not many. If a producer can't afford to feed their animals, they're going to be forced to sell them, often at a loss. Paul Gross told me that some producers are just now running into trouble, which means in a few months, when their feed supplies start running out, they could be forced to sell off their animals.
Okay, thanks, Mike. The big question now is, what comes next? Is the worst behind us? The experts we spoke with aren't 100% sure what will happen next.
The severe drought like this is consistent with future climate change predictions. So they predict in a warmer world that droughts will be more frequent and heat waves will be hotter. But that doesn't mean that this drought is because of climate change. So it's really impossible for us to say. If the drought happens again next year like this, then that would definitely be bad, but that's not very likely.
Oh, once the season is over, it's definitely not the end. The livestock producers using pasture systems have to think about, did my contingency plan work this year, or did I need to modify it?
We might think of ears of corn. Well, that's not the whole picture. Farm animals eat corn. And so if the corn is expensive to feed the farm animals, that makes meat expensive. And the effects of this can be long lasting, and we're just now starting to see them at the grocery store. Things that are processed or packaged foods involving these crops, it might take a year for it to play out, really.
Our livestock herd is continuing to shrink and shrink, and we're doing permanent damage to our demand.
My understanding is there's a concern about even going into next year that the fruit trees, because of the way they produce, there may be a year lag on when they're actually getting back to full production. So we'll have to watch that next year closely.
It's already affected the area because people aren't buying as much. We can see it at the markets where people walk through and sometimes they don't buy anything. They don't know what to think when prices go up, which we've had to raise the prices on cherry products. And so it has affected everybody.
And there's probably just going to be a little less selection out there, a little less variety, but I hope that it kind of brings some awareness to people that agriculture is a really uncertain thing.
All the vintners in northern Michigan that I've spoken with over the last few weeks are really excited about the 2012 crop because the size of it is huge, and with this heat, we're looking, all of us, towards just terrific grapes to be harvested this year.
From my perspective, the 2012 drought happened and now we have to recover from it. So how do we recover from it best to protect all of our resources? So protect our soil, protect our forages or our crops, protect our livestock, and make those changes into the future. That's what planning's all about, and being flexible and this year's drought, I call this year a surprise.
By continuing to pay close attention to weather patterns and studying climate conditions, hopefully experts' predictions allow enough warning. But for now, Michigan farmers and residents will just have to do their best and prepare for what may be to come in our great climate state.